Loretto, thank you very much. We arrive at week 2 of our looking at partition, past and future. And what we want to look at this evening and explore is the road to the Government of Ireland Act and to partition. And I want to begin, well, how we'll do it is I'll make some input and then we'll have a conversation together in a plenary. We'll take a bit of a break for tea or coffee or whatever, and then a second bit of input. And after that, Loretta will allocate us to rooms for about 10, 15 minutes discussion, conversation with each other. But the road to partition, and I want to begin with a quotation from the historian Dermot Ferreter in his book, The Border, the Legacy of a Century of Anglo-Irish Politics. And this appears at the beginning of that book. Ferreter writes, the island of Ireland was partitioned in 1920, partly due to a combination of British duplicity, the insecurities, fears and desires of Ulster Unionists, and the delusions and dashed hopes of Southern Irish Republicans, and partly because the likely alternative to a border was civil war. In subsequent decades, the border was cemented by aggressive political ideology, economic policy, and harrowing violence before its potency was tempered by a peace process and economic and political pragmatism. Its future, since the British electorate voted to leave the EU in June 2016, has been under focus not witnessed in decades, as it is the UK's only land border with another European country. Now, I suppose we might say that in a single paragraph, Ferreter has captured past, present, and future of a political decision which remains a live issue and the consequences of which may never go away. And the border was in the making for some time. We can talk, I think, about centuries of gestation. It's always difficult to know where to begin with Irish history and its relationship with the other island. We know it as Irish history. It is also British history, though rarely recognised in education and politics in England. In the 12th century, Ireland became part of the Plantagenet Empire, really a French empire, which had assimilated England at that time. Some may wish to begin a critical examination of the road to partition with the complex arrival of Henry II in 1172. There may, though, be more clarity in beginning with modern Irish history in the 16th century. From then, we can identify the patterns, dynamics that shaped the northeast of Ireland and why the border emerged where it did. In the 16th century, Ireland became England's first colony. Virginia, on the other side of the Atlantic, soon followed, and the first English empire began to take shape. The Tudors arrived in Ireland with Henry VIII, who became King of Ireland and head of the church. The church was Anglican, Henry's model of the 16th century European reformations. Now, if, as elsewhere in Europe, the religion of the ruler became the religion of the people, this did not happen in Ireland. Protestantism was to be and remain a minority expression of religion on this island. The Catholic Reformations also took root in Ireland as the religion of the majority, and with religion closely identified at the time with political power, sectarian politics and religion took root in Ireland. It was to be a lasting pattern. As the 16th century came to an end, a 9-year war developed in Ireland between the forces of Elizabeth I and Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone. O'Neill suffered defeat on Christmas Day 1601 at Kinsale, and he made his way back north with his bedraggled army. On the way, he stopped at Mellifont, sued for peace. By the time he reached home in Dungannon, he was poorer economically and politically. And in 1607, he left Rathmullen in Donegal with the Earl of Tyrconnell for mainland Europe, never to return. That was the end of Gaelic independence, of which Ulster had been the last bastion in Ireland. The English King James I had to ensure that Ulster was conquered and under control. Ulster had been the most troublesome part of Ireland, and James had to make its subjugation complete. So he introduced the Articles of Plantation in 1609, and the Articles had two main objectives. They were to subdue this troublesome province and to convert the native Gael from that false religion of Catholicism to the true faith of Protestantism. So the planters who arrived in the Ulster counties were Welsh and English, and the majority were Scots, who brought with them their reformed faith, Presbyterianism, the faith of John Calvin. It was a very different model of Reformation to Anglicanism. And not only did this produce tensions between Presbyterians and Anglicans, it established patterns of mistrust and suspicion between Presbyterians and Catholics, patterns of land ownership and cultural political division, and they have remained. The planters were settlers with settler mindsets, insecure, though rooted in their reformed theology of chosen people and promised land. Their worst fears were realized in 1641 when a Catholic rising took place. The numbers of Protestants were massacred, mainly by drowning in the River Bann. This created generational memory and was buried deeply in the Protestant psyche. In 1649, Oliver Cromwell arrived in Ireland to put down the rising, which he did brutally. And thousands were massacred in Drogheda and Wexford, which became also a generational memory for Catholics buried deeply in a Catholic psyche. Now, we needn't go detail with all of the history, but this takes us into a 17th century, which was a century of religious wars in Europe, and Ireland was no exception. Between 1689 and 1691, Ireland experienced the Williamite Wars. They were remembered in a particular way in Ireland, a Protestant victory over Catholics, still commemorated each year on the 12th of July. It was really a European war being fought out on Irish soil, which is why the Pope had backed the Protestant William of Orange in a power struggle against Louis XIV, a French expansionist, and why the Dutch King William's victory at the Battle of the Boyne was celebrated by the Catholic Habsburgs, who in Vienna sang a Te Deum. So the interpreted memory in Ireland was quite different. But in all of this now, we have the Anglican state church of 10%, in league with government. There really was no difference. Penal laws were introduced, and state churches and penal laws were common enough in Europe at this time, but state churches in Europe were the majority, enforcing penal laws against the minority. In Ireland, it was the other way round. The church of the minority enforced penal laws against the majority and ensured social, political, economic, and religious disadvantages, which was a way of controlling those perceived to be the enemy. In 1704, Queen Anne strengthened the penal laws, according to the preface, to prevent the further growth of popery. And now the penal laws were not only oppressive measures against Catholics, but also against Presbyterians. And this led to a mass exodus of Presbyterians after 1708 to North America. People will only be suppressed for so long, and a rising took place in 1798, which involved significant numbers of, though not all, Presbyterians in the rising against government forces. Presbyterians were dissenters and joined with Catholics in the rising. Presbyterians became the founders of Irish republicanism and the United Irishmen, and the rising was brutally crushed by sectarian government forces, with a rising of a few months claiming unknown numbers of lives, though perhaps as many as 80,000. And that, we can't begin to imagine, created the most horrendous trauma in Ireland. Well, it was a close call. After that, the government in London decided to bring in the Act of Union. The Act of Union abolished the Irish Parliament in College Green, and the 19th century then moved on towards Catholic emancipation in 1829, which was the emancipation not just of Catholics in Ireland, but Catholics in England, and also the emancipation of Jews. Daniel O'Connell was the great hero of that era. The repeal of the Union, O'Connell pursued that in the 19th century, but eventually died without that being recognised. And then there was a land issue that needed to be resolved. Catholics owned only about 15% of Irish land, the rest in the hands of Protestant ascendancy. About 1869, William Gladstone, who was Prime Minister, brought in an act which disestablished the state church, the Church of Ireland. For Gladstone, that was a moral issue. It was also a way of dismantling this Protestant ascendancy. He saw the Irish question in moral terms. And it was Gladstone who then introduced a Home Rule Bill in 1886, lost it, reintroduced a Home Rule Bill when he was back in power in 1893. Worth noting at this stage the kind of demographics in Ireland. By 1861, the Protestant population in the three Irish provinces, that's Connaught, Leinster and Munster, was about 8.9%. In the province of Ulster, it was 55.8%. And these demographics are significant for what was developed as the 19th century moved on. Because industrialisation developed in the northeast, the rest of Ireland was to remain largely rural and agricultural. Belfast began to grow as industrialisation expanded, becoming in the 19th century a city. The growth of factories and mills and shipbuilding brought population growth. And Belfast became a city where people lived in close proximity as houses were built with a density not known in housing development today. And the problem was that as people moved in from the rural areas, they lived as Catholics and Protestants back to back in tightly packed streets. Now, sectarianism already existed in Ireland, and especially in the northeast, where Plantation had established those patterns of religious and political sectarianism since the early 17th century. And as Belfast grew as an industrialised city, unsurprisingly, there were outbreaks of sectarian riots with bloodshed and loss of life every 10 years from 1859. Ulster, if you like, was already looking like a markedly different place, even a place apart. And as Belfast developed industrially, its port connections were with Glasgow and Liverpool. Belfast was becoming an industrial city of the empire. And all of this was to have significance as the 19th century moved towards the 20th century. Well, Gladstone introduced his Home Rule bills. And as each was defeated, the demand for Home Rule grew. And as each was defeated, the resistance from Unionists to Home Rule also grew. There was a young generation of nationalists who were becoming radicalised, rejecting the world of their parents, and increasingly for them, Home Rule was not enough. They wanted independence and freedom for Ireland. And from the mid-19th century, there was the formation of the Fenian Movement, a series of botched risings, but each failure enhanced the conviction. There was an increasing commitment to the use of physical force as a means to achieve Irish independence and freedom. Now, Unionists were also organising. Around 1893, they organised a massive event in Belfast Botanic Gardens, protesting Home Rule. It was attended by thousands, trains coming from all over Ulster at that time. The event represented Unionist organisational genius and was a spectacular logistical triumph. But on the edge of unionism, there was also a physical force tradition. Home rule, some were thinking, could be opposed with guns. The Ulster Unionist Council was formed in 1905 and its first leader was Walter Long. We'll come back to Walter Long. He was a leading member of the British Conservative Party. His mother was from County Wicklow. Long was an MP from 1880 and a member of the British Cabinet by 1895. The earliest leader of the Unionist grouping had been Colonel Edward Saunderson, who had been a Liberal MP for County Cavan. Long succeeded him as Unionist Party leader until 1910, when he was succeeded by Edward Carson. From 1905 to 1910, Long was MP for South County Dublin. And before and after World War I, he was very much associated with the Irish Unionist cause. And he it was who in 1919 chaired the Cabinet's Irish Situation Committee, whose report of the 4th of November laid the foundation for the Government of Ireland Act of December 1920 that brought about partition. We'll come back to Long in the second half. But in 1907, an Irish Unionist alliance was formed. And it is important to note at this stage that unionism was Irish unionism. It opposed home rule for all of Ireland. And at this point, it is not yet Ulster unionism. Soon it would be. The Irish Unionist Alliance produced the slogan or the mantra that home rule is Rome rule. And Unionists had a very real fear that a home rule Irish Parliament would be dominated and controlled by the Irish Catholic Church. And they saw this as a threat to their civil and religious liberty, and were strongly opposed to home rule for any part of Ireland. Now, before we stop for some conversation, we've gone over very quickly 4 centuries of history, leading to the most momentous change ever. There was, in all of this, a British-Irish problem, which was that of coloniser and colonised, complicated by the plantation of those mainly Scots to the northeast of Ireland. And even though the majority in Ulster were Protestant, Protestantism remained the minority on the island of Ireland. But the Protestants now were Unionists and Imperialists, wanting to remain in the Protestant UK and its Protestant Empire. The majority of Catholic nationalist population wanted home rule in the first decade of the 20th century. They may well have settled for that within the empire, because that is what was on offer. But there was, though, a minority within the majority who believed nothing short of independence and freedom from the UK and its empire would do. And in the second decade, the Catholic nationalist opinion, the second decade of the 20th century, Catholic nationalist opinion was to swing towards the demand for independence. The nationalist demand increased, as did Unionist resistance. And that resistance on both sides involved guns. And the decade before it was over would see violence and bloodshed and end in the partition of Ireland. I'm going to stop there, and you might have questions, or you might have comments or observations you want to make. There is, I suppose, a question that we might want to look at, and that is that to reflect on how much we carry the burden of history. And could our history at any point between that 16th and early 20th century, could that history at any point have been different? But let's see what conversation we have. Yeah. Okay, we're back and ready to roll here again. The end of the war, Ireland, well, at the beginning of the war, 1914, Ireland's on the brink of a civil war. The Home Rule Bill in 1914 is about to become law. The British cabinet fiddled while Ireland armed. And in a Home Rule bill, would Ulster be excluded? Or how much of Ulster would be excluded? And for how long? Would it be a 9-county exclusion or a 6-county exclusion? And would it be for 6 years or would it be permanent? And there was deadlock. And at the heart of it was the inclusion or exclusion of Tyrone. Tyrone is big. Asquith was even exploring the possibility of splitting County Tyrone. The king was deeply concerned. He made various overtures regarding an all-party conference in Ireland, and that conference was held in Buckingham Palace from the 21st to the 24th of July 1914. Government representatives were there, opposition representatives were there. John Redmond and John Dillon represented the Irish nationalists, Edward Carson, James Craig for the Unionists. Asquith, the Prime Minister, introduced 2 main points. Which area of Ulster would be excluded from the bill? And was there a time limit on the exclusion? And despite Unionist objections, they took the issue of the area first, and they never got to the question of a time limit. The conference collapsed, bringing Asquith to the brink of total despair. He complained of a sterile day spent discussing what he called that most damnable creation of the perverted ingenuity of man, the county of Tyrone. Well, apologies to anybody who's a native of Tyrone. But a month later, Britain's at war, and if anything, that avoided civil war in Ireland. In all of that, the rising then takes place. There is the Battle of the Somme, 2 events that lodge their way into psyches in Ireland, become iconic moments and crucial moments in history and memory. And you have Easter Monday and 1916, and Pearse reads an Irish proclamation of a provisional government from the front of the GPO in Dublin, an iconic document of Ireland's struggle for independence. Perhaps less remembered is the Ulster Provisional Government Proclamation, which was signed in September 1916 by 6 leading Ulster Unionists, including Carson and Thomas Sinclair, who had been the author of the Ulster Covenant. And that proclamation declared that Ulster men, that's the language used, as free citizens of the UK, would on the day a nationalist parliament was established, take over the governance of the province of Ulster. And there were also plans to print their own currency. Churchill described the Ulster Provisional Government as a self-selected body composed of persons who, to put it plainly, he said, are engaged in treasonable conspiracy. Now, all of this builds up, and partition begins to look inevitable. But there's still this question of inclusion and exclusion. And during the decade, actually 4 versions of Ulster were proposed. A 4-county, a 5-county, a 6-county, and a 9-county Ulster. And in 1912, Thomas Agar Robartes, an MP, proposed a 4-county solution. Armagh, Antrim, Down, and Derry would be excluded from Home Rule. Carson, interestingly, at this stage, seems to have an interest in a 9-county exclusion, the 9-county province of Ulster, though it's difficult to know how serious he was about that. Ulsterisation had reduced Irish unionism to Ulster unionism, and though Carson was an Irish unionist and remained an Irish unionist, he became caught up in the Ulster question. The British preference did seem to be for a 9-county province of Ulster exclusion. But then Unionists realised that a 9-county exclusion would give them a very, well, as they thought, a very precarious majority, and therefore being in time assimilated into an all-Ireland state. And it was James Craig, rather than Carson. James Craig was the architect of a 6-county exclusion, having control without losing a demographic majority. even though those Unionists would still have to deal with the very difficult nationalists in Fermanagh and in that most damnable creation, County Tyrone. Sinn Féin won a landslide victory in the 1918 election, also on a policy of abstentionism. They refused to take their 73 seats at Westminster. That left the floor to the Ulster Unionists and exclusive influence on the Irish question. In 1918, the British wanted three things: to preserve the Union and the Empire, to protect Ulster and the Southern Unionists, and to give self-government to the Irish majority. And here we are again with Walter Long, who comes into play. Long, this former Chief Secretary for Ireland, leader of Ulster Unionists from 1905 to 1910, a conservative who was sympathetic to the Unionists and opposed to Home Rule. But the interesting thing about Walter Long was he was a federalist and would have wanted a federal arrangement for the UK. And Lloyd George had already been talking earlier about what he called Home Rule all round. And Asquith himself had suggested federalism in 1914. And in 1918, Long proposed a federal solution. But for some reason, Lloyd George put a stop to proceedings on the 25th of July. Long's committee was reconvened. A report was brought before Parliament on the 4th of November 1919. It proposed two parliaments in Ireland and a Council of Ireland, which would work on matters of common interest, but also move towards reunification. The Conservatives accepted Home Rule only if Ulster remained within the UK. And so the partition of Ireland loomed closer. And that brings us to the crucial moment, the Government of Ireland Act of 1920. In the latter years of the decade, we can see these disagreements about the territory of Northern Ireland carried on into 1920. And as far as Long was concerned, his committee would leave the judgment on the inclusion of 6 counties or 9 counties of the province of Ulster to the Cabinet. Bonner Law was the convener of the Irish Committee, and Lloyd George, who was keen to have the inclusion question resolved before the Cabinet met, asked Law to reconvene the committee. Law came back with a recommendation that the whole province of Ulster should be included in the Northern Parliament. But Long, in talking to Unionists, was beginning to doubt this solution. If Donegal, Cavan and Monaghan were included, this would, he said, provide such an access of strength to the Roman Catholic Party that the supremacy of Unionists would be seriously threatened. And another influential Conservative, Arthur Balfour, came out against a 9-county inclusion. And so Conservative opinion was with James Craig and the Ulster Unionists, who ironically now did not want Ulster in their Home Rule Northern Parliament. By 24th of February 1920, Lord George had come back from the Paris Peace Conference, chaired the Cabinet, which Ronan Fanning has said finally capitulated before the onslaught of Long and Balfour and the Ulster Unionists. It reversed its committee's recommendations, gave the Ulster Unionists what they wanted, a Northern Ireland of 6 counties. The Government of Ireland bill went to the Commons the next day, where there was no significant nationalist voice to oppose it. Not surprisingly, 2 weeks later, with the bill still going through the parliamentary process, the Ulster Unionist Council endorsed it. Belfast MP Tom Moles rationalised the desertion of Unionists in Donegal, Cavan and Monaghan by arguing, and I quote, that in a sinking ship, with lifeboats sufficient for only 2/3 of the ship's company, were all to condemn themselves to death because all could not be saved. But to stay with the imagery, the Unionists of Donegal and Cavan and Monaghan could drown. The Ulster Unionists, well, Unionists, but no longer Ulster, were very satisfied James Craig's brother Charles, also a Westminster MP, triumphantly said, the bill practically gives us everything that we fought for, everything we armed ourselves for, and to attain which we raised our volunteers in 1913 and 14. The gun was also at the heart of Unionist politics. And so the bill made tortuous progress through all of 1920. The Government of Ireland Act was passed by a very poorly attended House of Commons, passed by 182 votes to 52, with the vast majority of MPs absent. And the Act got royal assent on the 23rd of December 1920. Ireland was partitioned, but so too was the province of Ulster. Okay, we can maybe go into groups for about 15 minutes, and I think Loretto can put a couple of questions up on the bottom of the screen. At what point in Irish history did partition become inevitable? Was it inevitable? Could it have been different? And who makes history? Who writes history? And who takes responsibility for history? 15 minutes, and we'll come back. Hello?
That's everybody back, Johnston?
We're back, Loretto. Thank you very much. Sorry, I must have missed your little notice going up, but thank you. Okay, we're back. I don't know what kind of discussion you had in your groups, but maybe we could share some of the contributions or insights, whether you looked at those questions or not. But they were, to remind you again, at what point in Irish history did partition become inevitable? Was it inevitable? Could it have been different? Any room or group like to jump in, or an individual?
Johnson, if
couple of voices there. I'm not sure who exactly.
I was going to ask Johnson.
Sorry, John, okay.
Simply going to ask, had Sinn Féin not adopted a policy of abstentionism, could things have been different?
Well, it left...
And kind of on what moral basis did they... Was that purely political against the British imperialism, and yet maybe short-sighted for the outcomes?
Well, it was on the basis of the 1918 election. And the 1918 election had been fought on the grounds of conscription. There had been a suggestion that the British were going to introduce, it wasn't a firm proposal, but a suggestion that they would introduce conscription to Ireland as well as elsewhere in the United Kingdom. Because this is towards the end of the war, and people on the ground with feet on the ground in the front the battlefields are running thin. So it just about unifies everybody in Ireland. Church, trade unions, women's movement, Sinn Féin. And they make it a big part of their election manifesto. They win this landslide victory, taking 73 seats out of 108 or so. And this landslide victory, but they've also fought this election on the basis of abstentionism. They attempt to set up a Dáil Éireann after that. They do set up a Dáil Éireann, which is not recognised by the British government. It would have been seen as an illegal parliament. But on a matter of political principle, I suppose they felt abstain. They're not going to take their seats in Westminster. 73 seats, mind you. Joe Devlin, the Belfast nationalist MP, is a member of Parliament at that stage, but they too, there are only about 6 of them after 1918. They have left Westminster as well. So the Unionists have the whole floor to themselves. And they can call the tune, and we're obviously calling the tune, if you like, with the British government, mainly a Conservative government. It's still a coalition government, but the Conservatives are in the majority in that government, though it's led by Lord George, who is Liberal. Now, Devlin did say at one point, Devlin was of the opinion that had Nationalists or Sinn Féin MPs been in the House of Commons, it would have made a difference. That's what he felt. Sinn Féin, of course, would deny that it did, or it would. But it's difficult not to think that number of MPs in, I know a house of 500 MPs probably, 79 or 80 Irish MPs, what difference would they make? But at least I think there would have been a voice in there that could have countered the government and Conservative Party in particular. As it was, the Unionists had the floor, the House to themselves. And I'm not sure, and people will disagree about this, I don't know about any party, and Unionists have played abstentionist games as well. I don't know that abstentionism has ever really worked.
I guess, Johnson, there were 2 points relating to the first question and one relating to the second that came out of our group. Yeah. The first one was partition inevitable? We debated more the argument that for inevitability, we didn't really have time to get on to look at other arguments, but maybe the argument for the inevitability was, if we look at the plantation, go back that far, why did it happen? For economic gain. And then, as you rightly pointed out in your narrative, by the time we reached 1912, 1820, the part of Ireland that was of economic benefit to Britain was the 6 counties. So it was convenient to accept it, get rid of the rest, move on. That was probably the mindset. The second point relating to that first question was, where was Christianity in all of this? Somebody in our group very clearly articulated a very strong argument that, everything that happened was so anti-Christian. So here's the irony of it. A country that's 100% Christian, or almost that, and yet these things could happen. And then we came on to the I think that came back then to a brief discussion around the type of theology that underpinned the political and economic arguments of the time. Yeah. And then the last question, who makes history? There was a strong view that the people who make history are the people who don't accept their responsibility but blame others. So it's written from that perspective. And so long as it continues to be written from that perspective, it'll be a skewed history.
Yeah, okay. I think your group raised a massive question, Stephen, where was Christian faith and theology and the whole thing? And it was there at the heart of it. Now, having said that, what kind of theology and what kind of Christianity was at the heart of it? And it seems to me that on all sides it was very much bound up. And remember, we're still very strongly in Christendom mode at this stage, when there is no separation of church and state anywhere in Europe, really. You've got all 6 empires that went into the First World War fighting holy wars with God on their side, so they believed. And you have churches and mosques acting as recruiting agents in this war. So there's a theology about at the time which I think has since well and truly collapsed. And well, I think it has. I don't think anybody would be serious today now about, for example, suggesting we're threatened by Rome rule.
Yeah,
in Ireland.
You're right, Johnston, but this needs to be really, really teased out, because I think it wasn't so much Christianity heart of it, but it was a warped view of religion. And if you listen to the narrative today will still be for God in Ulster on certain streets. Now, the fact that people mightn't set foot inside a Christian church is neither here nor there. It's still that's. So I think that's the legacy. And maybe it is a form of theology, or is it something different that we just haven't quite got to the bottom of yet?
Well, I think you talk about legacy, and I think it takes time to work through theological collapse, if you like, and Christendom has collapsed, but there are things still linger on, and I think a role for the churches. I think there are two things, maybe at least two things we still need to do. We need to deconstruct the mythologies of violence. And they are mythologies. And we need to deconstruct what I think we can call civil religion. And that's what we're talking about, was around widespread 100 years ago. We need to do a lot of theological work in deconstructing that, even though a lot of work was done on that, for example, by Econi, Evangelical Contribution in Northern Ireland. They broke the connection for a lot of evangelicals between God and Ulster. But as churches who were up to our ears in this theology 100 years ago, and if you're right, it still lurks about there. There are still, it's in a memory somewhere. then we need to well and truly deconstruct it. And we need to deconstruct it in an era when we are also critically beginning to look at the role of, and it does go back 100 years ago as well, we're beginning to critically look now at the role of imperialism, racism, and colonialism. And that's a theology that's in there that needs to be deconstructed. We call it the instrumentalization of God, the use of God to justify political dominance or whatever.
One of the bizarre experiences I had was listening to a guy, a Protestant guy, very strong Protestant, member of the Orange Order and all of that stuff. And he was complaining about the way that his Protestant identity was being threatened. And the guy probably wouldn't recognize the inside of a church if he walked into one by accident. So he was going on this screed about, his Protestant identity being threatened. And I gently suggested that one way of preserving his identity would be to go to church occasionally. And I had to take a couple of steps back because I thought he was going to clubber me.
Why do you think that was?
Because he looked very, very angry.
And did he attempt
all this thing about Protestant identity, and what is the Protestant identity about? Part of it is the religion. He probably knew all of the things that were wrong about Roman Catholicism, but he didn't have a clue about what Protestant Christianity really is. It was a political thing, civil religion.
Yeah.
It's actually quite scary.
Yeah. And maybe that's still another reason why the church needs to deconstruct this civil religion, both Catholic and Protestant, because it's been tied up with nationalisms of various shades and colours. And Stephen's probably right. It's still around in some shape or form. It's scary stuff. And would it make a comeback? Well, we need to make sure that it. I think it doesn't, because and this does go into questions of identity then, and we're not going to get terribly far. I think one of the big issues we address, whether it is because we're 100 years on from partition, or we go into the next 100 years, what is identity? What makes identity? And we've got to start acknowledging, maybe we need to acknowledge that identity is something we invent. We imagine it. And because we imagine it, we keep reimagining it. And as times change and as situations change, we find our identity shifting and changing. Trouble is, if you start to feel your identity is shifting and changing, and you don't want it to change, you're in for a pretty scary run yourself. Because the heart of what you think is absolute. But then that brings us back to the Protestant thing again. We've never really bothered too much, those of us who are in the Protestant tradition, we've never really bothered too much in Irish Protestantism, if we've bothered at all, about what's called the Protestant Principle. And the Protestant Principle is that if any viewpoint of anything becomes an absolute, you need to start getting critical about it. That's a Protestant principle. There's nothing absolute, nothing ultimate.
Johnston,
right. Richard.
Oh, okay. Somebody else wanted to speak there. I just want to make a comment that's related to what you've just said and what Stephen had said. I think that the Protestant church, at least the part of it that I experience, largely Methodist, is backing off that hard identity with Orangism, whatever. My concern is, where is the drift? Where is it going? If it's backing away from that, what direction is it going? And my sense is that it's going in the direction of a denial of the incarnation. That is, it's going in the direction of being all spirit. So it's going in the direction of praising the Lord. And it's using prayer as a kind of mechanism for that. Whereas the incarnation is saying that if there's truth around, it has to do with flesh. The word became flesh. It has to do with flesh. It has to do with creation. It has to do with the stuff. And one of the reasons that I am encouraged the last few years by the rise of public theology is that it takes the word actually seriously. So I remember a number of years ago, actually quite a senior Methodist minister said to me, I was visiting with some others coming back from Canada, and we were at a church being very nicely entertained. And the minister said to me, you know, the big trouble in Northern Ireland or in Ireland is that nobody believes in the divinity of Christ. And it sort of should be to hear him say that. And then I found myself saying to him a few seconds later, I won't mention his name, but I said, listen, everybody in Northern Ireland believes that Jesus was divine. Very few believe that he was human.
Yeah.
We don't take the humanity. We don't believe that Jesus was a guy. And I'm reluctant, actually, as a Methodist now, to be talking about Jesus as my savior. Although I'll tell you, if I'm put in a corner, I'll fight with anyone in that. But I don't want to be saying that, because Jesus is my brother. He's my companion. He's the one who understands that you don't always know which way to go. And Jesus is the one who says, Richard, I don't know which way to go, but you're there in Belfast or in Moira. So what do you think is the way we should go in Belfast or Moira? Because I'm elsewhere. So anyway, it's the humanity of Jesus, and one of the things that I think is important. And I think, by the way, this is not new in the church. One of the oldest heresies is called Docetism, Docetism, Docetism. It's that Jesus appeared to be human. And the early church, and I love some of those early church guys, they said, no, that's nonsense. Jesus was for real. It's a human being. So all of the truth that we have to deal with, all of our politics, all of our ethics, all of our theology, all of this, that, and the other thing has to do with earthly things. And when we pray, we are requesting a bit of silence in our lives, that the word might come through to us as to what we should do in this world tomorrow. So I think that the big sin, the big heresy of the modern church is Docetism. And the big heresy of the church. And actually, Marx spelled this out over a century ago. Religion has become an opiate. It's what gets us through, which is very nice. We need that. But anyway, that's my spiel.
It's 20
Yeah, I think when we talk, I mean, we need to bring this back to the historical thing and the partition thing. I think it's true. Incarnation is relational, it's embodied, and it's embedded. And that is why history is important to faith and theology. It's important that we critically appraise 100 years ago, 50 years ago, that we look at things through ethical and from a faith perspective, theological lens. We take history seriously. We take economics seriously. We take politics seriously. I think that's what you're saying, Richard. And that is faith. And I think it's faith at its best. It's faith as represented by those great Catholic social encyclicals, for example. It's faith represented by those social statements and papers of the World Council of Churches. It's when we're at our best. We're not always. And I think what's happening perhaps in Ireland at the moment is that we are all on a bit of a denial and escape and beating retreats and getting away from a relational, embodied, embedded faith. So, okay, we've hit 9 o'clock, but that is why we wrestle with partition. That's why we wrestle with what were the implications and legacies for the country. What are we still trying to deal with? And faith needs to address that as well. And part of that is deconstructing those, again, I think, mythologies of violence and the mythology of civil religion and religion that is opium and a narcotic.
Oh, Johnston, could you go back on the Protestant principle that you mentioned that I found interesting about? Yeah. Okay.
Well, quickly, Emma, the Protestant principle is when we make something into an absolute, we make something into an ultimate statement of truth or identity or whatever, then we need to become suspicious.
Yes.
We need to become critical. We need to start deconstructing it. That when things were as absolute and as ultimate as that in terms of the politicized religions and God in Ulster and for God in Ireland of 100 years ago, the Protestant principle ought to have been saying, hey, hang on, we need to question that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you.
Okay, listen, folks, we've gone to 9 o'clock. We better go home. We're at home. We don't need to go. We don't need to go anywhere. One of the great things about Zoom. But thank you very much for all those contributions this evening, and a very thoughtful evening, and big questions being posed. We come back next week, maybe to pick up something of this again, because we begin to look next week at the birth